So, let's say you're working on a car and you want to create some sort of a dynamic hydraulic reaction so that when the body actually moves forward or when the car moves forward, the body actually reacts to it appropriately without having to manually animate that. So I'm going to show you that right now. So basically you sort of want to create this action. It's actually a pretty simple setup, not the most obvious thing, but pretty simple to achieve. So let's say we're starting with just the simple model. So in this case, I have the model. It's very simple. It's just a cube that's been extruded out into the shape of a car. I have a couple of cylinders that I've made to tires, a main control curve that I have a little bit of animation on, and I have my tires in a group that's actually connected to follow my main control curve. And this is just so that when I play it back, it can demo the results. Okay, so first of all, we need to create something to actually control the dynamic motion that's going to occur in the car. So instead of actually directly affecting the car, we want to do it indirectly. This way you can actually start building the setup without having a car. So go to your right view, go to your joint tool, and just create a very short chain of joints. Okay, so I'm just going to drop that joint in there. Make a very short chain. So I'm going to have my root, and then I'll have my next joint, which is actually going to be the base of the chain that I'm going to be using to control the car. I'll create one more joint and then another one at the top just to sort of anchor things out. Okay, so I have essentially 4 joints. I'll just increase the size, make them easier to see, and I'll make my root a little thicker there. This is going to be my root. And then the rest are going to be my shocks. Okay? So that's what we need first. You need your joint chain, you need to position it wherever you're going to call the center of your vehicle's gravity. Then I'm going to take my main curve, so the curve that's going to control essentially the displacement of everything here, and I'm just going to constrain my root to follow it. So I'm just going to parent constrain it, maintaining offset. Okay, so this way when I play back my animation, we see that that chain follows along with the main. Okay, and then we can take our car, and I'm going to shift select not the root of the chain, but one of the joints above that. So I'm actually going to take the second one, and I'm going to do a smooth bind, or you can parent it, doesn't matter, it's up to you. You can parent the geometry to that joint, constrain it. I'm going to bind it in this case. If you're doing geocaching, you're going to want to do a bind. So I'm going to do bind to selected joints because I'm only selecting actually one joint. And you can do a geodesic, but it's one joint, so it doesn't matter, so distance will be fine. And the rest of the settings shouldn't matter for this case, since we're not doing any deformation. It just needs to follow. So just bind it. And so now when we play it back again, the car body should follow along perfectly. Okay, so now that we have that car body following, now we need to get it so that when it follows, its movements actually react relative to its momentum and displacement in space. So now that I have my car connected to follow that joint, I need to control the joint. So I need to go to the Create menu, and I'm going to use the CV Curve tool, go to the option box. I'm going to set the curve degree to linear, and linear will pretty much just allow me to click out exactly that. It'll allow me to click out the curve with CVs that actually have no arc on the spline, so it's linear. And I'm going to start at the base, and I'm going to use snap to point to click and snap that first CV onto the base of the shock joint chain. So I've got from the base of the shock joint chain to the tip of it, not including the root. Okay, so now I have a curve. I'm going to modify center pivot, and I'm going to call this curve my curve, and we'll call it shock. So with that curve selected, we're going to go to surfaces, and then under surfaces, you're going to go to edit curves, and you're going to do rebuild curve option box. And under rebuild, you want to make sure that you actually choose to rebuild the curve so that you can change the number of spans. Because when we actually clicked out the curve, it was only basically one span, and we need a few more spans for that if we want to get a functional and properly a usable curve in this case. It needs to be able to bend and needs spans to do that. So we apply that, it rebuilds the curve. So now if we actually go to the attribute editor, we should see under the curve shape that it now has 4 spans. Okay, and you can, of course, you don't need to rename it because it's the same curve, it's just now got a few extra spans. Okay, and with that curve selected, I'm going to go to End Dynamics and go to End Hair. If you're an older version of Maya, you'll probably still have the hair option available, so you could do that as well. And go to Make Selected Curves Dynamic. Okay, it makes that curve dynamic, and it creates all of these extra things. So if you look in your outliner, you'll see that now you have a hair system node, you have a nucleus, if you're using N hair or N cloth. And then you'll also have a hair system follicle and an output folder. So if you expand your hair system folder and then expand the follicle, you actually see that you actually have an object for your original curve. And then if you expand your output curves, you have a brand new dynamic curve. And so we're going to need the dynamic curve. I'm going to call that one my curve DYN for dynamic. Now, just to make things a little easier to see and to work with, I'm going to select my joint chain and just drop it onto a layer, just so that I can switch it on and off whenever I want. Okay, or switch it to template mode so I can actually keep track of things. Okay, so I have my overlapping curves because you still have your original, and then you have your duplicate dynamic curve. You're going to need to keep both, because your original curve still has influence over the original, and so you may need that. Okay, so now we're actually going to use our dynamic curve to control the joint chain. But first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my original curve, I'm going to select it in my outliner, and then go to it in the channels box. I'm going to set its visibility to off, just so that it doesn't get in the way while I'm working. Okay, so it's completely hidden now. And then I can activate my joint chain, and then we can move forward. So first thing we want to do is we want to go to animation menus, skeleton. You go to the IK spline handle tool, go to the option box. And by default, you're going to see something like this in your settings. And in this case, if you were using this normally, it would automatically generate a curve, but we already have a curve that we want to use. So we're going to disable a few things. First of all, we want to disable auto parent because we don't want it to automatically parent the curve to anything. We're going to handle that ourselves. Auto create curve, disable that because we already have a curve. Essentially, the only thing you want is root on curve. It's the only thing you really need. And so we're going to come in close, and you're actually going to select the first shock joint, not the root, but the joint just above it. Oops. Okay, click that joint, and then click on the very end joint. And then the last thing you're going to click on is essentially the curve. But you want to make sure you're getting the dynamic curve, which is why we turn the original curve invisible. So if you click in the same spot, you don't need shift or anything like that, just left click on it. It should select the curve. If it's having trouble selecting it, what you can do, if you're having trouble selecting it, what you can do is you can select your joints, and then you can hide your joints so they're not in the way, and then you can just left click on that curve, because it should be pretty easy to select that. And so if you have, let me make sure everything's showing. Okay, so if you have everything showing now, then you should see that we now have an IK handle. Your joints are highlighting in magenta, showing that there is some sort of incoming connection from the selected IK handle. And let's run a quick test here. If I rewind and play back my little demo animation, you can see that you'll see some stretching happening, because now that section of the joint chain is controlled by dynamics. Okay? So now we need to actually get that section to follow along. And currently that section is actually under the control of the dynamic curve, which also by default is under the control of our original curve. So if we rewind, take that original curve, and then we, let's say, select our root curve, and then smooth bind that original curve to, or that original curve to the root, it should follow along with the dynamic section in parallel. So if I rewind now and play back, now we can see that everything is following along. And you'll immediately see that the car body, which is bound to one of the joints in that dynamic joint chain, is responding to the movement. So it's a fairly simple setup. Beyond this, just a matter of going in and making some adjustments to the hair system dynamic properties. Like collisions, you can disable that, so you don't need to have it waste time calculating that. And then of course just a matter of going in and making a few adjustments in different places. One thing you definitely want to disable, you can disable things like the drag, and you can use things like the tangential drag and some of the other settings to basically to delay the reaction, to slow it down a little faster, to basically make a few adjustments to the physics that are being demonstrated by the response. So last but definitely not least, usually what you want to do, especially with something when it comes to dynamics, you want to create a way to switch your dynamics on and off. Because sometimes when you're actually working and you're scrubbing through the timeline, the dynamics, even though it is a hair curve, it won't necessarily always calculate the way you want, so it might look a little disturbing on screen, even though there's nothing really wrong with it. If you rewind it and play it back, it's fine. If you're just setting up a pose and you've actually done the setup correctly, you should be able to drag the car around and keyframe it wherever you need to. But if you're scrubbing through your frame, it's going to be a little disturbing if you're scrubbing a little faster than it can calculate. Okay, so it's usually a good idea to have a switch on there so you can just temporarily disable the dynamics, so you can set up your animation in peace, and then once you're done and you like the animation you have on the car, you can go back in, switch it on, and then make any adjustments you need to the dynamics. Usually what I'll do for that is I'll make sure I create an entire list of top level and keyable attributes on the control that's driving the car movement, so I don't have to dig into the dynamics all the time. And even if you're not going to put all of those on the top level, it's usually a good idea to create an on-off switch, and we can do that simply by controlling an aspect of either the follicle or the hair system self-directly. So select your whichever curve you're going to use to create the attribute, go to modify, add attribute, or you can simply control or command select in your channels box and choose add attribute while you're selected on whichever control you want to add it to. It'll bring up your add attribute window, and then you basically just create your switch. So in this case, let's say we'll call it shocks. And I'm going to use the enum, and you can also use Boolean, which will just create an on-off. You don't have to type any text or anything in. I like to use enum because I like to customize my labels a little more. And I like to get a little pull-down menu that it gives me. So, first I'm going to make, we'll just say manual. and which is going to be equal to off. The second one is going to equal on, and so we'll just call this one dynamic. Okay, and I'll make it lowercase just so it's consistent. And we'll just add that. And now if I close that, you'll see I have a little pull-down menu here. Okay, so I can choose manual and dynamic. And so I need to actually hook this in to actually control the dynamics. Okay, so now that we have our switch all set up on our control curve on our main, okay, we want to be able to actually control something with it. Right now it's just a switch that connects to nothing. So to connect this, we're going to need to basically select our follicle, go to the attribute editor, we need to go to the hair system shape. And it's the simulation method that we need to control, because this is what's going to control whether or not that follicle is trying to calculate the movement of the curve or not. And so since it has 4 different settings, and we want off and essentially either one of the last 2 settings, we need to use SDKs, which is probably going to be the easiest way to do this. So I'm going to first, of course, select my follicle, make sure I select the hair system shape, click the select button at the bottom of the attribute editor to confirm that, and then go to animate, set driven key, and set. It'll automatically load whichever node I have selected in the driven area. In this case, that's the hair system shape with our simulation method attribute, which is what we want. And now we need to select the control that contains the switch and load that as the driver. So you want to click on load driver. Make sure you don't confuse it with the driven. Driven is what's being controlled, not the controller. Okay, so now we've got main, which is our main control, and shocks, which is our main attribute. And its current setting is dynamic. And the simulation mode right now is set for all follicles. So if that's what you want as your default state for the dynamic setting, then you click key. So now we go back to our main and we switch it to our other setting, which is manual or off. And then go to the hair system shape, go back to its simulation mode setting, and switch it to off. Okay, because we want it to disable the simulation of that curve when it's in manual mode. And then we press key to lock that in as the default. So now we have 2 different modes locked in. So now if I have my car selected and I scrub my timeline, you'll see that now that dynamic curve is no longer calculating. Or at least if it's calculating, it's not having any effect on the curve that's controlling the joint chain, which controls the simulation of the shock absorbers. Okay? So now if I switch it back to dynamic, you'll see that our little switch is currently still working. Okay, so you can see the body moving. It's got the side movement, the lateral movement. Okay, so everything still works as desired. Now, of course, if you want to add some extra top-level controls so you can make fine-tune the movement of the body, you can just go in, create attributes for them, and then use the connection editor to make direct connections to some of those attributes within the hair system node.